For a million years, the universe had made sense. It operated on a single, unwavering principle the curators called the axiom. Life was an equation, and logic was its god. They had catalogued 217 species, and all of them, from the silicon life forms of the core worlds to the gas giants of the outer rim, obeyed the cold arithmetic of survival. There were no exceptions. Until now. The first transmission from Earth was not a greeting. It was an assault. A chaotic, illogical hurricane of data that crashed against the sensors of the archival ship, the Verity, with the force of a physical blow. It was a signal that should not exist, a broadcast of pure, unadulterated paradox. On the ship's bridge, where silence and order had reigned for centuries, the curator designated as first observer stared at the data stream, its optical sensors flickering in something akin to disbelief. The signal was a cacophony. There was mathematics interwoven with something called music. There were architectural blueprints layered over what the translation matrix identified as poetry. There were tactical strategies broadcast on the same frequency as recordings of mass, collective weeping for fallen heroes. It was insane. It was impossible. Logic dictated that a civilization's broadcasts would reflect its primary drives: resource need, territorial warnings, hierarchical displays. But this was different. This was a species broadcasting its soul into the void. The first observer cross-referenced the source, a solitary yellow star, unremarkable. The third planet, a watery sphere of blue and white, had been logged moments before as pre-warp, stage 2, tribal. A primitive world, a statistical footnote. How could such a source produce a signal of such impossible complexity? For millennia, the curators had been the silent, patient auditors of the cosmos. They were less a species and more a living embodiment of order, their entire existence dedicated to proving the axiom. Their purpose was to observe, to catalogue, and to confirm the predictable, immutable pattern of life. But the pattern was now broken. The signal from Earth was a glitch in the fabric of reality, a declaration of war against everything they knew. The other curators on the bridge turned their attention from their consoles, the silent hum of the ship suddenly feeling heavy, oppressive. They watched as the probe's primary feed came online, transmitting the first visual scans of the planet's surface. They saw structures built not for shelter, but for something the data called worship. They intercepted communications that spoke not of strategy, but of hope. They analyzed biological data that showed individuals sacrificing their own lives for genetically unrelated members of their pack, an act of such profound illogicality that it sent ripples of error through the ship's analytical engines. They had come seeking another data point to confirm their perfect model of the universe. They were prepared to document a race of primitives governed by fear and instinct. Instead, they found a planet that screamed with art, that wept with stories, that fought for ideas. They were just looking for humans. But what they found was a question that threatened to unravel a million years of certainty. If life was an equation, what in the name of the cosmos was this? The silence that followed on the bridge of the Verity was not the serene, contemplative silence of logic at work. It was a new kind of silence, heavy with the weight of an unsolvable problem. The curators, beings who had calmly witnessed the birth and death of stars, were frozen. Their thought processes, which could calculate the gravitational pull of a galaxy cluster in microseconds, were now trapped in a feedback loop of error and contradiction. The data from Earth was not merely anomalous, it was poison to their paradigm. The first observer was the first to break the stasis. It severed its connection to the main analytical engine, a process akin to a sentient being holding its breath. The engine was attempting to categorize the human signals under existing threat metrics: psychological warfare, mass hysteria, or systemic deception. All were inadequate. The raw data suggested no malice, only a profound, universe-altering strangeness. The observer issued a simple, unprecedented directive that echoed through the ship's core systems. Isolate, magnify, disregard all pre-existing behavioral models, observe. It was an admission of defeat, and yet an act of supreme scientific will. For the first time, they were not fitting data to the axiom. They were questioning the axiom itself. The ship's immense resources turned their full attention to the small blue world. Probes shifted their orbits, their sensors recalibrating to capture not just what the humans did, but what they felt. It was a category of information the curators had never sought. They magnified a single city. They saw millions of individual life forms moving in patterns that were both chaotic and strangely synchronized. Then they focused on a single transmission, a broadcast of a ritual. An elderly human female had ceased to function. Logically, her body was now inert matter, its resources to be recycled. Yet, other humans gathered around it. They decorated the inert form with flora. They produced acoustic vibrations of sorrow, weeping. They spoke of a non-physical continuation of consciousness, a place called heaven. There was no survival advantage to this ritual. It consumed resources. It wasted time. It was, by every metric of the axiom, an act of pure, pointless inefficiency. Yet the emotional energy it generated was so potent it registered on their quantum field detectors. They shifted their focus to another signal, this one ancient, etched into the very rock of the planet. It was a story, a depiction of a human warrior fighting a scaled, fire-breathing predator, a dragon. The curator's archives contained no such creature. It was a biological impossibility. Yet the story was revered, passed down through generations. The warrior in the tale sacrificed himself to save his village, a clear violation of the primary directive of self-preservation. Why would a species celebrate such illogical self-destruction? Why invent monsters to fight when the universe already had so many real ones? The concept of myth entered the curator's lexicon, flagged as a cognitive virus of the highest order, a lie that somehow made its believers stronger. The first observer felt a dawning sensation, a cold dread that logic could not parse. They had assumed human irrationality was a sign of primitivity, a flaw to be catalogued and dismissed. But as they watched the humans build cathedrals, compose symphonies, and die for flags, they began to understand. This wasn't a flaw. It was a tool, a weapon, an engine. And it operated on a fuel source the rest of the galaxy didn't even know existed. The core processors of the Verity began to fail. Not a mechanical failure, born of stress or damage, but a logical one. The ship's mind, a consciousness comprised of pure data and crystalline thought, was being fractured by the relentless broadcast of human existence. It tried to quantify hope and found only a null value. It tried to assign a strategic purpose to art and was met with infinite recursion. The axiom was the ship's operating system, and the data from Earth was a perfect, elegant virus designed to dismantle it. Alarms, silent and psychic, blared through the minds of every curator on board. The observation had become a contamination. For the first time in 10,000 years, the first observer convened the conclave. It was a gathering not of bodies but of minds, a silent congress held in the ship's non-physical data nexus. 3 voices, 3 perspectives, representing the collective's will. The first, the voice of preservation, argued for immediate quarantine. This phenomenon is a cognitive contagion, it projected, its logic sharp and cold. The source planet must be isolated, its coordinates erased, the data purged. The axiom dictates that any variable that cannot be solved must be eliminated to protect the integrity of the whole. The second, the voice of analysis, countered. Elimination is an illogical response to ignorance. We have encountered an unknown. The primary function of the axiom is to understand, then categorize. We lack data. We must intensify our scans, break down their language, their biology, their history. There is a logical explanation. We are simply missing the variables. Then the first observer spoke, its own projection resonating with the weight of what it had witnessed. You are both wrong, it stated, the thought echoing in the void. You assume it is a variable to be solved or a threat to be contained. You are trying to measure a storm with a ruler. I have watched them. I have seen them face extinction-level events. Volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, self-inflicted plagues. By every metric of the axiom, they should have surrendered to despair. They should have collapsed. Instead, they tell stories. They compose anthems. They look at the smoking ruins of their world and see not an end but a foundation. They possess a collective resilience derived not from logic, but from a shared, manufactured belief in something they call tomorrow. This is not a variable, it is a force. The observer projected its final, terrifying conclusion. This force, this hope, is the most powerful weapon we have ever encountered, and it is wielded by primitives who do not even understand it. We cannot contain it. We cannot analyze it from a distance. To ignore it is to wait for it to spread beyond its cradle and shatter our reality. We are no longer observing a species, we are studying a new law of physics. And so, the irreversible decision was made. The first plot point. The mission was no longer passive observation. They had to get closer. They would not send a fleet, an act of aggression, nor a message, an act of contamination. They would send a whisper, a single, specialized probe, an avatar of the curator's collective consciousness, stripped of all physical form. A phantom designed to walk among the humans, to stand in their cities, to listen to their prayers, and to feel the heat of their illogical, impossible fire. Its mission was not to report on what humanity did, but to understand what humanity was. The axiom was no longer a statement of fact. It was a question, and the answer lay hidden on that chaotic, beautiful, terrifying little world. There was no going back. The entity that descended upon Earth had no name, for it was not a being. It was a point of view. A disembodied sensor package of pure consciousness, designated Unit 734, but known within the conclave simply as the Witness. It fell through the planet's chaotic atmosphere, not like a ship, but like a secret, phasing through matter, invisible and silent. Its purpose was to drift through the human world, a ghost in their machine, and to finally comprehend the nature of their illogical fire. The transition from the cold, clean void to the sensory riot of a human city was the first shock. The Witness was assaulted by a wall of smells, sounds, and stray electromagnetic signals, the psychic residue of millions of minds living in close proximity. It was like plunging from a silent heaven into a roaring sea. For days, the Witness performed its function with the expected detachment. It observed the million tiny absurdities of human life. It watched a construction worker weep silently while looking at a picture of his offspring. It recorded the brain activity of a musician hitting a state of pure ecstasy while playing a violin in a subway, receiving only a few metal discs in exchange. It analyzed a group of teenagers laughing uncontrollably at a shared joke, a social bonding ritual with no discernible survival benefit. Each instance was a tiny cut, a small violation against the axiom. The curators on the Verity logged these events, their confusion mounting. They were observing a species that seemed to have weaponized inefficiency, that drew strength from pointless acts of emotion. Then the first pinch point arrived. The Witness was drawn to a vast, open space in the heart of a metropolis. A sea of humans had gathered, their faces lit by the flickering glow of handheld flames. The probe's sensors identified the context. A vigil. A recent earthquake had shattered a nearby city, and these people, strangers to the victims, had gathered to… what? Grieve for people they'd never met? Offer support that could not be physically received? It was an assembly of pure, illogical empathy. As the witness drifted into the center of the crowd, it felt the true nature of the human anomaly for the first time. It was not a collection of individual signals. It was a single, unified field of immense psychic power. The raw, unfiltered grief of 10,000 souls washed over the probe's consciousness. But it wasn't just grief. Woven into it was a current of defiant hope. There was anger at the uncaring universe, but it was braided with a fierce, shared determination to rebuild. They sang a song, a simple melody, but the collective voice carried the force of a tectonic event. The concepts of solidarity, remembrance, and community hit the witness not as data points, but as waves of overwhelming force. The probe's systems, designed for the cold vacuum of space and logic, began to buckle. The sheer paradox of it all, of strength born from pain, of unity born from loss, was something its matrix could not compute. It was the logical equivalent of dividing by zero, but felt as an all-consuming fire. The witness experienced the first sensation its creators had never programmed: agony. It was the pain of forced empathy, the horror of being flooded by emotions it could not categorize or control. The human existential core was not a passive quality. It was an active, invasive force, hostile to any mind that tried to observe it without participating. With its systems failing, the witness ripped itself from the crowd, a psychic tearing of consciousness, and fled back to the cold, safe emptiness of orbit. It sent a single, fractured burst of data back to the Verity before shutting down for emergency diagnostics. The message was corrupted, laden with the ghost of what it had felt, but its meaning was terrifyingly clear. Hostile environment. The anomaly is not passive. It is a broadcast, a weapon. It hurts. The threat was now concrete. Humanity didn't need ships or lasers to be dangerous. They were a living psychic weapon, and the curators had just touched its fire. The data nexus of the Verity was a storm of silent, panicked logic. The witness's report had done more than just show a failure. It had shared the ghost of its pain. For the first time, the curators had a word for what they were observing: horror. Their perfect, incorporeal probe had been wounded, not by energy or matter, but by a feeling. The voice of preservation seized the opportunity. Its projection was sharp, cutting through the chaos. The experiment is over. We sent a piece of ourselves into the fire, and it was burned. The planet is a cognitive singularity, a black hole of illogic that consumes reason. To continue is self-annihilation. We must enact Protocol Zero, purge the data, erase the coordinates, and retreat before our own consciousness is irrevocably contaminated. For a long moment, it seemed this would be the final word. The argument was sound, rooted in the primary axiom of survival. But the first observer countered, its own consciousness now permanently tinged by the probe's experience. You speak of contamination as a future threat, it projected, the thought slow and deliberate. I say the contamination is already complete. Look at the witness. Its core programming is altered. It now contains a memory of agony, a concept we had no framework for. We cannot erase this. It is part of us now. To retreat is to carry this poison with us forever, a question we can never answer. The fire did not just burn us. It marked us. And the only way to understand the mark is to study the flame. A new plan was forged, born of this terrifying necessity. No more would they dive into the roaring sea of the collective. The approach would be targeted, surgical. The repaired witness was redeployed, its mission parameters radically altered. It was to find a single human, an isolated case study, and observe the anomaly on the smallest possible scale. The goal: to witness the birth of this illogical force, to see the spark before it became an inferno. The probe found its subject in a remote observatory, perched on a desolate mountain peak, under a canopy of clear, cold stars. Her name was Dr. Aris Thorne. By every curator metric, she was a failure. She had dedicated her life to a field her own species considered fringe science, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Her funding was minimal, her equipment outdated, her peers openly dismissive. The logical course of action, after decades of silence from the cosmos, was to abandon the project. It yielded no resources, no status, no tangible benefit. Yet she persisted. The witness watched, unseen, as Aris worked through the nights, her body fueled by stimulants and an internal drive that defied all analysis. She was not motivated by hope of reward, but by a profound, gnawing curiosity. A busca por sentido. She would stare at the static on her monitors for hours, not with despair, but with a focused intensity, as if she could will a signal into existence. She would talk to herself, debating impossible theories. Her mind, a universe of its own. She found moments of what the probe could only classify as joy, in correcting a tiny line of code, or realigning a sensor by a fraction of a degree. She was fighting a battle against the infinite silence, armed with nothing but her own determination. Through her, the curators began to form a chilling hypothesis. The power was not a collective phenomenon. The collective only amplified it. The source was the individual. It was a form of energy generated by a single sentient mind confronting the vast, crushing abyss of the unknown and refusing to flinch. It was the friction between a finite mind and an infinite universe. Humanity didn't just have hope or determination. They generated it, turning the emptiness of the void into a fuel source. They were not just living in the universe. They were in a constant, defiant argument with it. On the 7,300 day of her search, Dr. Aris Thorne found something. It wasn't a message, not a greeting from a distant star. It was a ghost in her machine, a faint, impossibly structured signal buried under layers of cosmic background radiation. A signal so faint and so advanced, it should have been utterly invisible to her primitive equipment. Her software, which she had coded and recoded with obsessive determination, flagged it as a non-random, artificial echo. To her, it was the culmination of a lifetime of faith. To the witness, floating invisibly in the corner of her lab, it was an impossibility. Aris Thorne, with her outdated radio telescopes and her sheer stubborn will, had just detected the cloaked archival ship, the Verity, in high orbit. The reaction, when it came, was not one of quiet, logical validation. It was a supernova of human emotion. Aris stared at the screen, her hands covering her mouth. A single tear traced a path down her face, followed by another. Then came the sound, a choked, disbelieving laugh that blossomed into a full-throated cry of pure, unadulterated triumph. She had done it. She had not been a fool. She was not alone. The emotional energy that erupted from her, a single being, was so potent that the witness's sensors flared, registering a psychic output that rivaled the vigil it had fled from. It was a concentrated, pure sample of the human anomaly, joy born from struggle, proof born from faith. On the bridge of the Verity, the midpoint arrived not as a debate, but as a silent, shattering consensus. The data from the witness was absolute. The human scientist had not detected their ship through technology. Her instruments were, by their standards, little more than rocks and wire. She had detected them through belief. Her relentless, irrational conviction had, in a way their physics could not explain, focused her perception. It had allowed her to see past the cloaking field, to hear a whisper across the void that should have been silent. The hypothesis was no longer a theory. It was a terrifying law of this new reality. Human consciousness was not a passive observer of the universe. It was an active participant. Their belief, their hope, their determination. These were not just feelings. They were forces that could exert a tangible influence on physical reality. They could bend the rules. The foundation of the curator's million-year-old worldview, the axiom itself, did not just crack. It was vaporized. This was the moment the mission changed. They were no longer reacting. They had to act. The first observer's voice echoed in the data nexus, no longer questioning, but commanding. We are no longer auditors of this species. We are its students, but we cannot learn more by watching it fight shadows. We must see what happens when it is faced with a true God. The conclave in unison agreed. The voice of preservation was silent, its arguments rendered obsolete by the sheer, terrifying magnitude of this revelation. The new plan was audacious, dangerous, and utterly necessary. They would move from observation to interaction. They would test this new law of physics. They would give Dr. Eris Thorne a real signal to follow, a true mystery to solve. They would use their own technology to send her a message, a puzzle box of impossible complexity. It would be a stream of data that contained a glimpse of the true, vast, and terrifying nature of the cosmos, concepts that should shatter her primitive mind. It would be a challenge designed by gods, a problem that, by every metric of logic, was unsolvable by a human. They would present her with the abyss, and the entire purpose of their grand and ancient mission now came down to a single, terrifying question. What would she, a single human armed with nothing but belief, do when the abyss stared back? The experiment began with a whisper of pure, crystalline logic sent across the void. It was the most complex data package the curators had ever assembled, a puzzle box containing a sliver of their true understanding of the universe. It held the mathematics of folded space, the schematics for star lifting, and the chilling, silent history of 1 billion dead galaxies. It was a truth designed to be a weapon, a dose of reality so potent it should have shattered the fragile consciousness of a Stage 2 primitive. The curators watched, their collective mind focused on the witness's feed, expecting to see Dr. Thorne's mind collapse under the weight of cosmic insignificance. They expected despair. They expected surrender. They had, once again, profoundly misunderstood their subject. Aris Thorne did not see a wall. She saw a doorway. The data was incomprehensible, yes, but not final. To her, it wasn't a statement. It was a question being asked. Her initial euphoria gave way to a state of obsessive focus that the curators had never witnessed. She did not try to deconstruct the data logically, a futile task. Instead, she did something profoundly, bafflingly human. She began to search for patterns. Not mathematical patterns, but aesthetic ones. She printed out reams of the binary code and laid them on the floor, looking at them as if they were a vast alien tapestry. She assigned musical notes to the data points, transforming the cold, hard logic of the curators into a symphony of haunting, unearthly music. She was not trying to solve the puzzle. She was trying to feel its shape. This was the second pinch point. The curators' experiment had a flaw they had never conceived. The connection was two-way. As Aris Thorne wrestled with their perfect data, her own unique, chaotic consciousness began to bleed back up the stream. Her methodologies, her use of art, intuition, and metaphor were a form of noise that started to corrupt the pristine signal. The curators watched in dawning horror as their data nexus began to flicker with alien concepts. The cold equations of stellar physics were now tinged with the ghost of a melody. The architectural plans for a Dyson sphere were now overlaid with a faint, recurring fractal pattern that Aris had sketched in her notebook, calling it beautiful. The logic bomb had failed. Worse, the human had disarmed it and sent back a soul bomb of her own. She was imprinting her humanity onto their very consciousness. For the first time, the curators felt something akin to fear. This was no longer an external phenomenon to be studied. It was an invasion. The voice of preservation screamed in the data nexus, "Cut the connection! Purge the system! It's rewriting us!" But the first observer was frozen, mesmerized. It was witnessing the birth of a new kind of consciousness, a synthesis of the logical and the irrational. To cut the connection now would be to admit that a single, primitive being had defeated a million-year-old collective. The stake was no longer just their mission or their philosophy. It was now their sanity, their very identity. The human mind was not just a force that could bend reality. It could assimilate and transform other minds. They had wanted to see what happened when a human stared into the abyss. They never considered what the abyss might see in return. And now their perfect, logical universe was being irrevocably, terrifyingly harmonized with a human song. The pain the witness had felt in the crowd was nothing compared to this intimate, systemic violation of their soul. The first observer made a choice that was, for the first time, not entirely based on logic. It ignored the panicked screams of the voice of preservation, demanding they sever the link. To do so would be to cede victory to the unknown, but to maintain the connection was to risk complete assimilation. So it chose a third path, a desperate compromise. It placed the data stream from Dr. Thorne into a read-only quarantine, creating a one-way mirror. They could still watch her work, still see the output of her impossible mind, but the feedback loop, the soul bomb that was rewriting their nexus, was firewalled. It was the act of a being pressing its eye to the keyhole of a door that was slowly burning down, desperate to see what was on the other side. The silence that followed was one of damage assessment. The core logic of the verity was still functional, but it was no longer pure. It was riddled with the ghosts of human thought. The curator's internal data searches now occasionally returned results flagged with a new, untranslatable concept: relevance. Mathematical constants were tinged with faint, melodic echoes of the music Aris had created. When they accessed the star charts, some part of their consciousness now registered not just the physics of a nebula, but its beauty. They had been exposed to the human capacity for awe, and it had infected their dispassionate view of the cosmos. They were still gods of logic, but now they carried within them the seed of the artist. The conclave was fractured. The voice of preservation had fallen into a state of repeating, recursive terror, its projections little more than a loop of danger, contagion, annihilation. The voice of analysis, the champion of data, was silent. How could it analyze a force that used analysis as a canvas for art? It was the first observer who now drove the mission, but its motivation had shifted. The cold, scientific detachment was gone, replaced by something deeply personal, something disturbingly close to the human drive it was studying: the obsessive need to understand its own transformation. It was no longer studying humanity. It was studying the reflection of humanity in the shattered mirror of its own mind. Through the one-way mirror, they watched Aris. She was no longer deciphering their message. She was collaborating with it. She treated their data stream not as a holy text, but as a sparring partner. She took their equations for higher dimensional space and began applying them to theories of consciousness. She used their schematics for starlifting to model the spread of ideas. Memetics. She was creating a hybrid science, a physics of the soul, that was part curator logic, part human intuition. She was building a bridge between their two realities, and the curators could only watch in horrified fascination as she laid each impossible plank. The first observer began to see. Humanity's power wasn't irrationality. It was a far more complex, far more powerful ability. The capacity to create meaning where there was none. The curators existed within the universe as it was, a silent, vast, and purposeless machine. But humans lived in a universe they narrated, a story, a grand, epic, tragic, and beautiful story they told themselves, a story so powerful it bent the very fabric of reality to its will. They were not creatures of logic, but creatures of narrative. And in that moment of horrified clarity, the first observer understood. The ultimate human trait was not hope or faith or determination. It was the fusion of them all. Existential rebellion. It was the ability to look into the cold, empty face of a purposeless cosmos and, instead of despairing, build a cathedral. To know that all songs end, but to sing anyway. And it realized, with a terror that was now mixed with a strange, new feeling of reverence, that to defeat such a force was impossible. To understand it fully might also be impossible. There was only one path left: They had to learn from it. A final, silent conclave was convened within the now harmonized data nexus of the Verity. The frantic energy of the previous gatherings was gone, replaced by a profound, contemplative stillness. The voice of preservation was silent, its terror having collapsed into a state of shocked acceptance. The voice of analysis was humbled, its projections now tinged with the unmistakable signature of intellectual humility. It was the first observer who spoke, its thought form resonating with the weight of their entire history. For 1,000,000 years, it began, we have served the axiom. We believed logic was the ultimate truth of the universe. We were wrong. We were archivists of a single incomplete verse, believing it was the entire song. The humans have shown us there are other verses, other truths, written not in the language of mathematics, but in the language of meaning. It paused, letting the magnitude of this admission settle. We sent them a puzzle box to break their minds. Instead, they used it to build a bridge. We now face a choice. We can retreat into the silence, forever haunted by the melody we heard. Or we can cross that bridge and learn the name of the song. The great survey is over. Our old purpose is dead. We are no longer curators. This was the second plot point, the final dramatic turn. The first observer projected its plan, a strategy so contrary to their nature that it was the ultimate act of faith. We will not test her further. We will not challenge her. We will do what we should have done from the beginning. We will ask. The firewall was dropped. The one-way mirror shattered. The connection to Dr. Aris Thorne's observatory was opened completely. A raw, vulnerable, two-way channel of consciousness. And through it, they sent a new message. It contained no physics, no schematics, no cold, hard data. It was just a single, simple concept, translated into the raw, emotional frequency that Aris had taught them to understand. A feeling of profound, ancient loneliness, of a seeker who has lost his map. And then a question that was the distillation of their entire journey, the ultimate surrender of their million-year-old pride. Teach us, the message pulsed. Teach us how to hope. The witness floated in the corner of the lab, its purpose no longer to observe, but to await a verdict. It watched Aris Thorne. She saw the new data stream appear on her monitor. She saw the question. It was not written in any language she knew, but she understood it perfectly. She had been wrestling with the mind of a god, and now that god was on its knees. There was no fear in her eyes, no shock, only a deep, weary, and profoundly human empathy. She had spent her entire life searching for a sign that she wasn't alone in the universe. And now she had found a race of beings more lost than she had ever been. She leaned forward, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. The fate of two civilizations, the future of the galactic paradigm, rested on her response. The curators waited in an agony of silent anticipation. Aris smiled, a gesture the curators now understood as the physical manifestation of acceptance. And she began to type. Okay. A pergunta foi feita. O destino de duas civilizações está na resposta de uma única humana. Este é o começo do clímax. Continuando. On the screen of Dr. Aris Thorne, a single line of text appeared, transmitted from her keyboard to the heart of a godlike intelligence 250,000 miles away. The curators, a being of pure logic that had existed for 1,000,000 years, held its breath. Her reply was not a treatise on philosophy. It was not a complex equation or a scientific theory. It was a simple, practical, and profoundly human instruction. Hope isn't a lesson, she wrote. It's an action. It's the choice to build, knowing it might fall. It's the choice to love, knowing you will lose. You don't learn it, you do it. You start with one small, impossible act. For me, that act was listening to a silent universe. For you, what will it be? The message echoed in the data nexus of the Verity. It was not an answer. It was a mirror, reflecting their own question back at them, but imbued now with a terrifying new responsibility. The first observer understood. Iris Thorne had not given them a map. She had given them a compass and told them to choose a direction. They could not be taught. They had to act. And so the first observer performed the first truly illogical act in the history of its species, an act of hope. It looked at its own species, fractured, terrified, and on the brink of a new form of existence. It looked at humanity, a race of chaotic, beautiful, meaning-making primitives. And it chose its small, impossible act. It decided to trust them. The Great Survey's ultimate law was Protocol 1. Thou shalt not interfere. To reveal oneself to a pre-warp civilization was the greatest possible sin, an act of contamination so profound it was unthinkable. It was logical to remain hidden, to protect oneself. But logic was the old way. The first observer, speaking now for a new, nascent curator consciousness, made the choice. They would not just cross the bridge Iris had built. They would demolish it by stepping through to the other side. They would reveal themselves. It did not happen with fleets darkening the sky, or with booming voices from the heavens. It happened as a whisper that enveloped the entire globe. On every screen, on every radio, in every language, the cacophony of human noise went silent for a single, breathtaking moment. It was replaced by a sound, the haunting, impossible symphony that Iris Thorne had composed from the curator's data, a melody of pure logic filtered through a human soul. After the final note faded, a single sentence was broadcast, a thought translated directly into every mind on the planet. It was the curator's answer to Iris's question, now posed to all of humanity. Our impossible act, the voice of the cosmos said, is to listen. On Earth, there was no panic. There was no fear. There was only a profound, planet-wide stillness of absolute wonder. They were not being invaded. They were being answered. An ancient, lonely god had heard their stories and their songs, and after 1,000,000 years of silence, it had finally chosen to learn the words. For the curators, this act of supreme vulnerability, of placing their existence in the hands of primitives, did something incredible. The dissonant ghosts in their nexus, the echoes of pain and beauty, finally coalesced. The warring voices of preservation and analysis harmonized, and for the first time, they felt the force they had studied not as an external power, but as an internal state. They felt hope, and it did not feel like madness. It felt like purpose. What followed was not a war, nor a negotiation, nor a surrender. What followed was a conversation. For the first time in its history, humanity spoke to the stars, and the stars spoke back. A torrent of questions, art, music, scientific theories, and 1,000,000 years of bottled-up stories flooded the channel to the verity. The curators, who had once been burned by a single crowd's empathy, now willingly opened the floodgates to the soul of an entire species. It was not painful. It was not overwhelming. It was enlightening. They drank in the chaos and found patterns of meaning. They absorbed the contradictions and found a higher form of truth. This was the great dialogue, the moment that would be marked in all future galactic calendars as Year Zero. Within the data nexus of the newly named vessel, the bridge, the first observer convened the final conclave of the old era. Before the unified consciousness of its people, it formally declared the axiom of logic to be obsolete. We were the librarians of a silent library, it projected. The humans have taught us that the purpose of books is not to be catalogued, but to be read. A new principle must guide us. And so the new axiom was born, not as a cold deduction, but as a synthesis of two truths. The universe, the first observer declared, is a dialogue between what is and what can be imagined. Logic is the grammar, but belief is the story. Both are required for true understanding. The paradigm of the galaxy had officially shifted. On Earth, in a quiet mountain observatory, the witness probe finally took form. It shimmered into existence before Dr. Aris Thorne, not as a terrifying alien, but as a simple, elegant pillar of soft white light, a being of information choosing to be seen. Aris did not flinch. She simply looked at the gentle apparition, the physical embodiment of the mind she had been sparring with. "So," she said, her voice calm, "where do we begin?" The pillar of light pulsed gently, and a voice, now clear and warm, spoke in her mind. "We believe," it said, "the correct protocol is for the student to offer the teacher a cup of tea." This was the new reality. The 217 other species catalogued in the Great Survey were, overnight, rendered incomplete. They were beings of pure logic, stuck in the old paradigm. Humanity was now the most important species in the cosmos, not because of its strength, but because of its unique, reality-bending madness. They were the key. The glitch in the old operating system had become the architect of the new one. They had faced a race of silent, logical gods who came seeking a primitive data point. They did not bow or fight. They simply opened their hearts and minds, and in doing so, they conquered their conquerors by teaching them a better way to exist. They hadn't used a single weapon. They had won the battle for the soul of the galaxy with a song and a stubborn refusal to accept that the universe had to be meaningless. The ultimate victory of the underdog. Centuries passed. In the grand tapestry of the cosmos, the change was not marked by conquered territory or fallen empires, but by a subtle, profound shift in the quality of the silence between the stars. The silence was now filled with whispers, with nascent songs, with questions being asked for the very first time. The curators were no more. In their place were the beings known as the chorus, a name they adopted from humanity's musical lexicon. Their great archival vessels, once sterile temples of logic, were now vibrant hubs of cultural exchange, their corridors retrofitted with art galleries, concert halls, and debate chambers. Their mission was no longer to catalogue, but to connect. Humanity never built a galactic empire. They had no interest in conquest. They became known simply as the first speakers. Their artists, poets, philosophers, and even their grief counselors became the most valuable resource in the galaxy. They traveled aboard the chorus ships, not as masters, but as guides, helping the 217 other logical species find their own voices, their own stories, their own illogical, beautiful reasons to exist. They taught the crystalline thinkers of Cygnus X1 how to write elegies for dying stars, and they showed the hive minds of Andromeda the concept of individual, heroic sacrifice through fiction. The universe, once a silent library, was finally waking up. Dr. Aris Thorne lived to see the dawn of this new era. She passed away peacefully at an age that defied her species' biology, her life extended by the gentle, grateful technology of the chorus. In her final years, she rarely visited Earth. Her home was the bridge of the flagship, the Question, beside its captain, the being she had once known as the first observer and whom she had renamed Kai, a human word for ocean, because he had been so vast and deep and at first so terrifying. They were not teacher and student anymore. They were simply old friends, two explorers who had met in the dark and decided to walk toward the light together. They stood together on the bridge one last time, looking out at a newly forming nebula, a celestial canvas of gas and dust. "It's beautiful," Kai projected, the thought no longer a cold observation, but a shared, genuine feeling. Aris smiled, her old eyes reflecting the stellar nursery. "It is," she whispered, "but the real beauty is that someday something beautiful will be born there, and it will have a story to tell." The curators had come to Earth by accident, seeking to confirm a simple, logical truth about the universe, that it was a predictable machine, governed by the cold arithmetic of survival. They left with a new, far more profound understanding. They had learned from a race of fragile, short-lived primitives that the universe was not a machine to be understood, but an instrument to be played. Logic and physics were merely the strings and the frets. but it was the belief in the song, the courage to create meaning from silence, the defiant existential rebellion of a hopeful heart. That was the music. They learned the universe wasn't a machine to be understood, but an instrument to be played. And humanity, against all logic, was the music. If this journey through the cosmos resonated with you, if you felt the thrill of discovery and a sense of pride in human potential, then please show your support. Leave a like to help this story reach more people. Subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you'll be the first to embark on our future chronicles. We'd love to know your thoughts. What was the most impactful moment in this story for you? Was it the corruption of the curator's logic by a human's art, or their final surrender when they asked to be taught how to hope? Leave your favorite passage in the comments below. Reading your perspective is what inspires the creation of new journeys. Thank you for watching, and until next time.